Mark Dunton, Contemporary Record Specialist here at the National Archives in Kew. And I'm delighted to welcome Sir Anthony Seldon, one of Britain's greatest contemporary historians. Anthony, you've now written over 30 books on contemporary political history subjects, including several acclaimed biographies of prime ministers. Can you tell us, what is it that clearly fascinates you about what goes on behind that black, shiny door in Downing Street?
I think, Mark, it is the mystery and the secrecy and the fact that you're dealing with, or they're dealing with issues of the very greatest importance to the nation. I mean, this is not a local government or a town council. This is the government of the United Kingdom. And throughout the last 300 years of the Prime Minister, at times it has been presiding over the greatest power on earth. So what happens behind that black door really matters, and the heart of what really happens round this table, or the real version of this table, rather than this elegant reconstruction of it. We're all pretty nosy, you know, as people, Mark. I'm very nosy, and I want to know. I want to find out the truth.
Yes, I think we can all relate to that. As you mentioned, you know, we're sat here at our facsimile cabinet table, and indeed, the UK government cabinet is the subject of our conversation today. I'd like us to look at what is cabinet and what is its role, and really with a mission to sort of try and demystify it. Would you be able to define what is cabinet?
Cabinet is the supreme decision-making body in the British government. So it evolved out of the King's Council and out of the Privy Council, a committee of the Privy Council. So the King was surrounded by the heads of the Admiralty and the Army and Customs and Excise and the Office of Works and the Treasury. And bit by bit, the oversight of these people, the heads of the government departments, passed from the monarch to the Prime Minister. So the word cabinet is descended from the French word cabinet, that means a room in which the senior ministers met. And from 1735 onwards, when the Prime Minister, an office created in 1721, 1735, the then monarch George I gave number 10 Downing Street to the Prime Minister. And in that house, at the back of the house, is a pretty small room in which cabinet has been meeting. So it evolved from 1721 gradually. The King's Council blended into the Prime Minister's Council, the Prime Minister's Cabinet. George III attended Cabinet for the last time in 1784 for a monarch, and progressively in the 19th century, as the power of the monarch declined, the power of the Prime Minister increased, and the Cabinet became the essential body for the Prime Minister, bringing together those heads of government departments. The numbers of those, of course, increased as government came into economic and social policy, but it remained the coordinating body, the supreme decision-making body, the body that oversaw the strategy for government and dealt with emergencies, whether health emergencies, many plagues in British history, for example, or wars or threats of invasion. So the role pretty much the same, but it's evolved.
Yeah, it's a gradual evolution, and I think you've summed that up very well for us. When you look at the history of cabinet government, one theme that seems to come out very strongly is how cabinet is always evolving. It has a sort of elastic quality, and one can see this in, for example, the size of the cabinet. So this has really fluctuated. So I know that in 1886 there were 14 members. When Lloyd George became Prime Minister in 1916, he immediately opted for a small war cabinet of only 5 members, but then, of course, that inevitably got added to as others could attend. And then Lloyd George's post-World War cabinet had about 20 members. And it seems to me that it's more or less hovered around that figure ever since. But then, on the other hand, Prime Ministers from Walpole onwards have often used the ploy of a inner cabinet with just a really small little circle of senior colleagues. This has happened quite often, I think, over the years, hasn't it?
Well, indeed, it has, Mark. Now, the reason why the numbers have gradually increased is the expansion of the role of central government, taking up many of the functions that local government had performed and adding new ones as government moved into economic life and social policy life, so health and housing and education and trade and industry and transport are all government departments that have been added since Walpole's day. But the absolute number is capped in part by the number that anybody reasonably can have a discussion around. You can't have a discussion with 100 people. But also, Downing Street itself, number 10, is a small building for a head of government. The cabinet table can't be much bigger than taking perhaps 24 people round it. So physically, the numbers have increased up to that maximum number of low 20s. But as you were saying, Mark, at moments of crisis, particularly the First and the Second World War, the Prime Minister wants to deal with a very small number because partly for reasons of secrecy, the more people who take part in discussions, the more people who could leak potentially disastrously sensitive information if it was to get out to the enemy, but also it's easier to get a consensus on a smaller number of people. So you have the full cabinet, low 20s generally in peacetime, in wartime, effectively much smaller group. But all the time, actually, the Prime Minister is talking to a much smaller group of those people they really trust round the cabinet table, but also from their inner circle, people who are not members of cabinet.
And also, another thing that fluctuates, it seems to me, is, or has fluctuated a bit over the years, is how frequently cabinet meets. That has fluctuated quite a bit over time, hasn't it?
It has, and cabinet used to be a very informal body. It became formalised in 1916, and after the Second World War, the norm was to have 2 meetings from 1945 to 1976, 1977, then reduced to 1, initially Thursdays and then Tuesdays. The meetings last about 2 hours. Prime Ministers are very wary about it going on too long because there's always the worry, if it's going on too long, that the press waiting outside will think there's a crisis on or there's a big disagreement. So they're very keen to get it all down. A lot of the things are pre-cooked. So the Prime Minister has their agenda and they'll go through legislative business for that week in front of the House of Commons. They'll go through domestic issues and foreign issues. If there's a crisis they're dealing with, well, that will take more time, but a lot of it's pre-cooked. The idea that 22 people can have a free-ranging discussion on these enormous affairs of state is, of course, It couldn't happen in the time. I mean, 2 hours zips by. And then an innovation, Mark, during the COVID crisis was for the first time in British history. Well, of course, Walpole and Disraeli and Gladstone couldn't have had virtual meetings. They might have wanted to have had them. But for the first time from March 2020, Cabinet was meeting virtually, which is taking it to a new level.
It does seem amazing that, before David Lloyd George became Prime Minister in December 1916, cabinets met without an agenda and without a secretary. So there were no formal minutes taken, and ministers had to take action on what they thought had been decided in a cabinet meeting. They had to rely on their memories. And of course, this could be a recipe for confusion and misunderstanding. Why do you think that such an amateurish approach, as it seems to us now, was tolerated for such a long time?
Well, I think we have to set it in the context of the time. That's what history is about. It was a less legalistic, formulaic, bureaucratic age in general. That said, politics lagging behind business in withholding the writing down of proper minutes. I think part of the reason for that is that this evolved out of the monarchy. It was the King's Council cabinet. These were the councillors advising the monarch, so the monarch could take the decisions. There was a chief minister before a prime minister emerged in 1721, and there was that sense that you somehow don't write these things down. There was also a sense that the people were bonded together by a trust. They were often, not always, of the same party. They were certainly of the same social class. They attended the same public schools, often the same universities. There was a sense that they were good chaps together, and of course they were chaps until 1931, when women started appearing in that Labour government from 1929 to 1931. There was a sense of honour. We have to see it in that evolutionary sense of history and a move towards a more organic, bureaucratic age and era. And then, as you say, it really became, after 27 months of war, First World War started in early August 1914, by December 1916, the increasingly decrepit in terms of his ability to keep government together, Asquith, supplanted by Lloyd George, far more organisationally minded, and brought in Maurice Hankey, who had been Secretary of the Committee of Imperial Defence, which was a key forerunner of cabinet, already well grounded in the need to have to have an agenda. This is what we're going to discuss today, and then you're going to take minutes of what's discussed, and then you're going to circulate those minutes. So there is an established record. Now there was a written record, there were follow-up processes in play, and government was becoming mature from the beginning of the 20th century. Indeed,
that's right. And of course, when all that happened under David Lloyd George, you get this feeling of tremendous dynamism, coming in, and it's like a revolution in government. Yeah. And as you say, Anthony, he appoints the first cabinet secretary, Maurice Hankey. It's an interesting role because I think the duties go a great deal wider than the term cabinet secretary suggests. That's right, isn't it? It is. And for long periods of the 105 years since 1916, when Maurice Hankey, the first cabinet meeting properly with agendas and minutes taken, the 9th of December 1916, the incoming, very dynamic Prime Minister David Lloyd George, they're bringing in Maurice Hankey,
still the longest serving of the 13 cabinet secretaries we've had in the last 105 years. He served from 1916 through to 1938, and it could have become a much less significant post, I think. But when he resigned in 1938, Edward Bridges, son of Robert Bridges, the poet laureate, became cabinet secretary and would record the minutes in exactly the same handwriting that he had with a fountain pen, of course, that he used when he was a subaltern and officer in the First World War, writing his diary, the officer's diary during. Exactly, it's fascinating looking at his notes. But it was the Second World War that really consolidated the position of the cabinet secretary, because Churchill, when he became prime minister in May 1940, wanted to get over the mistake that had happened under Asquith in the First World War, where you had a civilian and a military side very separate. And he had Bridges, the second cabinet secretary, overseeing the civilian side, the departments overseeing the domestic side, and someone called Pug Ismay overseeing the military side. And he grew to like Bridges, such a supreme hard worker, so dedicated, so capable, so modest, so effective, so loyal. And by 1945, it was becoming clear that the cabinet secretary was a more important position than either the permanent secretary of the Treasury or the permanent secretary of the Cabinet Office. But the cabinet secretary, Mark, is the person sitting by the right hand of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, going through with the Prime Minister beforehand what's going to be coming up, what the Prime Minister might say, what the Foreign Secretary might say, what the Trade Secretary or the Education Secretary might say, how to deal with that. It's all pre-screened. The idea the Prime Minister has a moment of any day of his life which isn't pre-cooked for them, and it's the Cabinet Secretary who is the principal chef. Chef de cabinet, indeed, who is pre-cooking the Prime Minister's notes, including the Cabinet and the Cabinet committees.
Yes, indeed. And, of course, an extremely useful resource for the Prime Minister. Now, an important principle under which Cabinet operates is, of course, Cabinet collective responsibility, which essentially means that once the government's policy has been decided, ministers are expected to support that policy, particularly in public, of course, or resign. And I suppose to a large degree, the Cabinet minutes that we hold here at the National Archives reflect that. It's been said about them that the minutes, they're really designed to reflect consensus and agreement rather than necessarily to, heighten disagreements. But of course, in my experience of reading through these, the Cabinet minutes are not devoid of colour. And of course, this Cabinet collective responsibility, so under this, there have been some notable resignations over the years, haven't there?
So if Cabinet, Mark, is like a football cup final, then the resignations are the penalties. I mean, they're the moments that really focus our attention. And resignations are happening when cabinet ministers cannot accept government policy as decreed by the Prime Minister, though of course they're also doing it when they think that their own political careers will be helped and boosted by uncoupling themselves from government policy in a major walkout or statement, knowing that the media love these cup final penalty shootout moments. So the full glare of publicity is totally assured. So in the post-war period, we could look at, say, April 1951, when Nye Bevan, health minister, resigned from Clement Attlee's government over the imposition of charges on dentures and spectacles, clashing with that great socialistic Labour ideal of a free national health service. And there were rumblings of war, Korean War in the background, and that didn't fit in at all well. And it suited Bevan to resign. So that was very much a major focus of attention, a very significant resignation that played its part in the unravelling of the Attlee government that had won a general election only a year before in 1950. And, however powerful a Prime Minister is, a resignation against them is significant. A Prime Minister is as strong as their ability, or indeed a leader of the opposition, to hold their team around them together and to have the confidence of that team, knowing that their assassin, in a Caesar-like way, will be in their close court. Around them, when they look at their faces beaming at the Prime Minister, with a cabinet secretary by the side, there will be, behind those smiles, the smiles of their future assassin.
The historian Peter Hennessy, who I know you know well, he wrote that cabinet government is a putty-like concept. A Prime Minister can make of it largely what he or she will. Sometimes cabinets are very much centre stage, and sometimes they're more kind of operating in the background. But this is also bound up with the individual styles of Prime Ministers, isn't it? Could you compare for us some of the different styles of Prime Ministers in chairing their cabinets, perhaps taking one or two 20th century examples?
Yeah. I think Peter Hennessy's description of it being a putty-like operation cabinet is really good. And it builds on the whole idea, Mark, that we don't have a written constitution in Britain. So how the Prime Ministers interpret their jobs, the 55, they've interpreted them in 55 different ways. And indeed more than that, because the longer ones have often been very different in the beginning, the middle and the end of their premiership. So cabinet, absolutely, is at times, particularly when the Prime Minister is weak, very dominant. But when the Prime Minister's strong, maybe they've just won a general election, they have a mandate, their personal popularity ratings are high, policies are going well, the economy is strong, Britain's position in the world is having its head held high, then there's very little cabinet can do, because cabinet ultimately is a collectivity of the prime ministerial successors, and much of their animal nature and spirit comes from the fact that they are capable and waiting to take over from the Prime Minister and holding the Prime Minister to account far more, in effect, than the opposition parties do in Parliament. So different Prime Ministers have very different styles. They often come in wanting to be collegiate. Even Margaret Thatcher was more collegiate in her more divided cabinet to begin with, that was full of many people hostile to her. But then she became more dictatorial. They all tend to become more dictatorial, putting cabinet on the back burner in as far as they can. But, Mark, once they lose their political capital, they have to fall back on their cabinet. They need the support and affirmation of cabinet to keep going. But left to their own devices, they would all want to. They are in politics not to be nice and sweet and charming to their cabinet ministers, and not to go down in history books and in the archives here in the National Archives as really good and collegiate people. I mean, bunk. I mean, they couldn't care less about that. What they care about is making a difference, and their legacy, and getting their favoured policies through. And to do that, cabinet are entirely secondary to that greater purpose.
Yes.
And I think we must remember that. And they don't forget it, by the way, for 1 minute. They have no illusions that they are significant to the Prime Minister in any way other than forwarding the Prime Minister's own political ambitions and agenda.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, just to conclude, Anthony, would you say that the sort of collective decision-making that's enshrined in Cabinet, at least in theory, is an important sort of symbol of our national democracy?
Well, it is, and the United Kingdom is a temporary make-up of countries that come in. Ireland came in in 1801 and then left in 1921. Scotland, 1707, 1603, 1707, but in the waiting lounge at the moment. Wales, who knows? I mean, so you need to have a sense in which they're all there together, those responsible for overseeing the different parts of the UK and different segments of national life. So it is a collectivity. It retains much of the original function of having the kings or the queen's councillors and main representatives, heads of the government departments. Remember, the Prime Minister doesn't have a government department. They don't have the statutory powers and authorities that those people charged with doing the business. The Prime Minister is the Field Marshal who decides what the policy is, and then it's the generals in the field who have to go in and do the fighting and do the delivery. And so they're needed to group together around this cabinet table in this tight, rather cramped room at the back of number 10, and to get a sense that this is the place, once a week, where the key people in Britain are meeting together to hammer out responses to crises like on COVID, but national policies over the economy, society. It's a living organism. It isn't anything fixed in marble, and it's a mixture of personal chemistry, raw in-tooth political power, the state of the economy, the state of popularity of the party in power, whether it's in coalition or not, the position of MPs in the House of Commons. It's an admixture of many, many things that go to make it up. But it's not going to go away.
Right. Well, thank you, Sir Anthony, for giving us, the benefit of your wisdom and your knowledge about Cabinet. And I hope that our conversation today may help to demystify Cabinet for many people. It does remain at the very apex of the political system, however its fortunes evolve. Sure. And thank you so much.
Well, a great pleasure, Mark, and great pleasure to be round this excellent reconstruction of the Cabinet table and in this wonderful archive, the richest government archives anywhere in the world. What better place to be than here?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.